One would have thought I'd be used to this by now, typing with one arm. It takes time to get used to, especially when you spent most of your life in front of a keyboard. Muscle memory digs deep. A few years ago, I was in a car accident. I was going 60 down an empty road, coming home from a long day of overtime, when some kind of animal came charging out of the woods. Trying to avoid a collision, I swerved off the road. My front left wheel got caught in a ditch, sending the entire vehicle careening off the road, only to smash into the trunk of an ill-placed black walnut tree, driver's side first. I have this vague memory of blinking lights and vague shapes in the distance. I was so cold, but at the same time it was so unreal. I couldn't even understand what had happened. I was brought into emergency surgery. My left arm was literally hanging by the thread of my jacket. It had come off clean by the socket. According to the surgeons, I was lucky. Most of my shoulder was intact, so it became a matter of salvaging what they could. The cut had been clean. I did suffer some whiplash damage to my neck and lower back, but considering I could have easily died or gotten paralyzed, losing an arm was considered mild. Looking back at it, I am inclined to agree. Considering what could have gone down, I was damn lucky. Still, in that luck, I wished I could have gotten just a tiny bit luckier. See, I had this gold ring that I'd been given by my later mother. A simple thing with the engraving of a musical note on the inside, a memento of our shared love of music. We played Louis Armstrong at her funeral. That ring disappeared in the accident. Somehow that's what bothered me the most. My arm could be reattached, it could heal, but that little memento was just gone. What followed was a long period of intense physical therapy, medication, and painful readjustments. It took weeks before I could even move my fingers again, and when I did, it felt like pushing your nerves through an unwashed garlic press. It was this stunning chemical level kind of pain, the kind where your body just shuts down, begging you to stop. But over time, I started to get over it. Small movements started to get better. I could tie my shoes, press the space bar, hold a knife. I wasn't about to juggle anytime soon, or play the piano, but I could get by. Soon enough, I got back to work. People were glad to see me. I wasn't going to be able to work at full capacity in my usual role, but I could still sit in on meetings. I won't bore you with the details, but most of my work relies on answering emails, proofreading, and translation. It's pretty technical stuff that requires a lot of pitter-patter on keyboards. At one point, I was stuck in a particularly drawn-out meeting between two clients that we were facilitating. I was there mostly as an observer to fill the seats, but I was supposed to weigh in if something related to my department came up. Of course, it didn't, but I still had to act interested. My colleague was trying to draw up a compromise between the two parties, laying out terms and conditions. Meanwhile, I was nursing a cup of coffee and waiting for the day to be over. Looking over to my side, I noticed something odd. I wasn't just holding the coffee cup with my left hand, I was stroking it with my index finger. Sort of like how you'd scratch a wary cat under its chin. It was a strange sensation. I was looking at my own arm, my own hand, and I couldn't feel what was happening. I couldn't feel the ceramics tapping against my finger, or the twitch of the nerve as it contracted and extended. It was just happening. An involuntary twitch, perhaps, but it didn't feel like it. It felt intended somehow. A few similar events took place that day. Grabbing the bathroom door for a little too long, knocking over desktop decorations, suddenly letting go of my jacket as I was about to head home. It was just little things. I was still having trouble even using my arm in the first place, so these quirks didn't bother me too much. A friend of mine was giving me a ride home. I wasn't at 100% yet, and sitting behind the steering wheel felt like inviting disaster. Instead, I sat in the passenger seat, nodding off as the trees passed me by with a steady rhythm, causing me to blink. A noise pulled me back. The driver said something, but I wasn't paying attention. Turning to him, I excused myself. "Sorry, what was that?" I asked. "What are you doing?" the driver repeated. I looked over. My left hand was wrapped around the parking brake, as if ready to pull. I forced myself to let go. "Nothing," I said. "Sorry, it's nothing." "Right," he nodded. "Just don't do that." "Yeah," I agreed. Yeah, no, sorry. That night I was exhausted. It felt like my lungs had been robbed of breath. I felt weak and trembling. I was cold, yet feverish. Famished, but without an appetite. I went to bed early, face planting into the pillow. I had horrible nightmares, none of which I can remember. I kept waking up over and over, not being able to discern dream from reality. My bed was soaked with cold sweat, sending shiver after shiver up my spine. By the early hours of the morning, a stray ray of sunshine burned my eyes open. I was lying on my side, looking towards the window, leaning on my left shoulder. The fingers of my left hand were moving on their own, and not just moving, but bent in every which way, as if lacking bones. They were vibrating, shuddering, like wounded worms fearing a predator. I grabbed my hand and my fingers were back to normal. I could move them as usual. For a moment, I was doubting what I'd seen. It was one thing to experience oddities, but that was unreal. I must have laid there for half an hour, just expanding and contracting my hand, begging my body to work with me. Enough of this, I begged. Please. Enough. Please. I clapped my hands, cracked my fingers, and ran them through my hair. It was fine. Nothing out of the ordinary. Right? A couple of weeks passed without any serious peculiarities. I could even work a little. There were a few of oddities, like unknowingly grasping a warm cup or my fingers pointing in all directions when in contact with cold water. Just strange little things that I could easily get control of. That was until one morning at work. We were out of coffee, so I was making myself a cup of tea instead. As the water came to a boiling point, I accidentally spilled some on my arm. The reaction was immediate. My arm whipped out to the side, throwing the pot across the room. For a moment, my arm looked like it didn't have any bones, rippling like a skin-covered liquid. It made me think of it not as a part of me, but as an alien thing attached to my shoulder. And for a brief moment, in the blink of a heartbeat, I could see my fingers grow and shrink, fingernails throbbing like a cat throwing up a hairball. Suddenly, it stopped. Looking back, I could see one of my coworkers watching me from the other side of the room. She must have heard the crash. "You all right?" she asked. "Yeah, just got a burn," I sighed. I'll be fine." She side-eyed the broken pot on the other side of the room and nodded, not entirely convinced. As soon as she left, I looked down on my hand as if shying away from a wild animal. It was alien to me. It was something other. A twitch was one thing, but this was downright unnatural. Coming home that night, I had a weekend ahead of me. I ran my symptoms through a couple of online services. While there are a few ways the human body can trick itself, like the alien hand syndrome or phantom pains, this was different. Physical properties do not rapidly change. Then again, maybe I was imagining it. I decided to do something crazy, an experiment. I wanted to recreate what had happened in the break room. I boiled up some water and poured it into a cup. I held my left hand over my sink, grabbing the cup with my right. I stood there trying to calm myself. I wasn't insane. This was a rational thought that I had to play out in order to eliminate an outlandish possibility. I prepped a cold pack and ran the tap. Then, taking a deep breath, I poured some of the boiling water on my left hand. 12 fingers. My hand split into 12 fingers, lined with raw, open wounds. My wrist rolled like a cobra fixing its eyes on a prey animal. This was no longer an arm, it was a nest of flesh-colored snakes. My mind blanked. I fell backwards, smacking at my arm as if trying to kill it. I couldn't feel a thing. It's as if all sense of touch ended at my shoulder. I crawled backwards on the floor, trying to wave my arm away, but it clung to me like a parasite fixed on my shoulder. Seconds later, a searing pain ran up my arm. Looking down on my hand, it looked as it always had. It was just a hand with a burn. I could barely feel it through the pounding in my chest. Every noise in the room was overshadowed by my pulse. I ran my hand under a tap and wrapped a cold pack around the wrist. It wasn't a bad burn, but it wasn't nothing. I did some research, looking up news from around the time my accident took place. There were a couple of reports, but nothing out of the ordinary. A domestic call, a brawl at a local restaurant, a couple of missing pets. There were a couple of other reports, but they were short and didn't lead anywhere. A mention of a couple disturbances, some idiot blasting music in a parking lot. But there was one more thing I noticed. In one of the reports covering my accident, there was a picture of the car. There was spatter of the blood on the hood, with something meaty stuck in the grill, as if I'd hit an animal. That caught my interest. I couldn't remember hitting anything, so what the hell was that about? The next day my arm was acting up even worse. It kept going cold, as if circulation was cutting in and out. Before heading out, I wrapped it up in bandages. Partly because of the cold sensation and partly because I just didn't trust it. There was no way to tell what could happen or why. I managed to get a hold of the owner of the junkyard where my trashed car had been towed. I went over there early in the day, just before the fog cleared. Now this was long after the car had been crushed and stored, but it was the only lead I had. An older woman greeted me at the gates, letting me in. We had a short chat about the accident as she showed me around, ending up at a stack of metal that could hardly be recognized as anything. The only thing to even hint at my car being in that pile was a thin slice of colored metal from one of the doors. I dug around there for about 20 minutes, all while being observed by this old woman. "Yeah, won't find much," she said. "If the police didn't get it, the insurance folks did." "Been a lot of people digging around?" "Not a lot, nah," she said, shaking her head. "But you ain't the first." And she was right. There wasn't a drop of blood or bone or anything. It was just scrap metal in a pile of even more scrap metal. I was wasting my time, but as I was about to leave, I noticed something. I hadn't thought about it, but I could see the old woman was wearing a ring. It looked like a wedding ring at first, but she was wearing it on the wrong finger. I pointed to it. "You found that?" "What about it?" she asked. "It's got a tune engraved on the inside, right? Like a music note?" There was no response. She just looked at me and sighed. Turns out I was right. She gave it back. She'd found it near the hood of the car the night they brought it in. Grabbing it was just a spur-of-the-moment thing, and since no one had come asking for it, she'd kept it. I was a bit annoyed, but mostly relieved that I got it back. But the question remained, how had that ended up at the hood of the car? "There was all kinds of gunk just kind of hanging there," she said. "Figured it was an animal. And you're sure that's where you found it?" "Sure as sure can be, yeah." I stood there for a moment, feeling an uncomfortable thought forming in the back of my head. There was no way for that ring to go from my broken arm on the driver's side to a pile of meat stuck in the grill of the car. But the proof of it had been in front of me all along. I had worn that ring for 12 years. There was a permanent indent on my finger. Looking down at my left hand, there was no such indent. This wasn't my arm. As soon as that thought settled in my mind, I could feel the arm twist and turn. Hadn't it been for the bandages, there's no way to tell what it would have done. It squirmed and pulled against me, thrashing like a dying fish on land. The old woman just looked at me. "You all right? Want me to call someone?" she asked. I don't know," I said. "I don't know." I had to get to the bottom of this. I hurried out of there as fast as I could. It was getting late in the afternoon when I got back home. Grabbing an old backpack and a couple of painkillers, I was about to head right back out. But a thought hit me. Maybe it wasn't as abstract as I thought. Maybe it wasn't just a feeling. Maybe something was really there. Looking down at my arm, I could feel it stirring, just within my control. Something sleeping, waiting to spring into action. With my right hand on the front door, I stopped and spoke out loud. "Whatever you want, just don't," I asked. "Don't." There was no response, no stirring. On a spur-of-the-moment whim, I packed one more thing into my backpack, just in case, a Hail Mary. Making my way to the scene of the accident, it was impossible to tell anything had ever happened there. I could barely even make out the place where I swerved, or where my wheel got caught in the ditch. I found the general area in the field where my car had spun out of control, and from there it was easy to find the tree I'd smashed into. It was still there. I spent hours going over it all, following the path the car had taken, starting from that tree and working my way back. There was nothing there, nothing new. It was all just gravel, weeds, and pavement. What had I expected? A signed confession? As the sun dipped behind the clouds, I could feel a cold wind coming on. I'd lost track of time. As I turned back, there was a sudden cramp in my arm. A shock of pain crept up my spine, spreading throughout my body like a spider's web. I could feel my left arm throbbing against the bandage wrap. Something was wrong. I was in the middle of the field. I could see for miles in every direction. Cars passing by in the distance. Wet grass staining my pants all the way up to my knees. And this one cold wind cutting straight through my clothes. I shivered, but my left arm didn't. Taking a step back towards where I came from, another shot of pain struck me. This one tripped me, sending me face first into the grass. I dug around there for about 20 minutes, all while being observed by this old woman. "Yeah, I won't find much," she said. "If the police didn't get it, the insurance folks did." "Been a lot of people digging around?" "Not a lot, nah," she said, shaking her head. "But you ain't the first." And she was right. There wasn't a drop of blood or bone or anything. It was just scrap metal in a pile of even more scrap metal. I was wasting my time. But as I was about to leave, I noticed something. I hadn't thought about it, but I could see the old woman was wearing a ring. It looked like a wedding ring at first, but she was wearing it on the wrong finger. I pointed to it. "You found that?" "What about it?" she asked. "It's got a tune engraved on the inside, right? Like a music note?" There was no response. She just looked at me and sighed. Turns out I was right. She gave it back. She'd found it near the hood of the car the night they brought it in. Grabbing it was just a spur-of-the-moment thing, and since no one had come asking for it, she'd kept it. I was a bit annoyed, but mostly relieved that I got it back. But the question remained, how had that ended up at the hood of the car? "There was all kinds of gunk just kind of hanging there," she said. "Figured it was an animal." "And you're sure that's where you found it?" "Sure as sure can be, yeah." I stood there for a moment, feeling an uncomfortable thought forming in the back of my head. There was no way for that ring to go from my broken arm on the driver's side to a pile of meat stuck in the grill of the car. But the proof of it had been in front of me all along. I had worn that ring for 12 years. There was a permanent indent on my finger. Looking down at my left hand, there was no such indent. This wasn't my arm. As soon as that thought settled in my mind, I could feel the arm twist and turn. Hadn't it been for the bandages, there's no way to tell what it would have done. It squirmed and pulled against me, thrashing like a dying fish on land. The old woman just looked at me. "You all right? Want me to call someone?" she asked. I don't know," I said. "I don't know?" I had to get to the bottom of this. I hurried out of there as fast as I could. It was getting late in the afternoon when I got back home. Grabbing an old backpack and a couple of painkillers, I was about to head right back out. But a thought hit me. Maybe it wasn't as abstract as I thought. Maybe it wasn't just a feeling. Maybe something was really there. Looking down at my arm, I could feel it stirring, just within my control. Something sleeping, waiting to spring into action. With my right hand on the front door, I stopped and spoke out loud. "Whatever you want, just don't," I asked. "Don't!" There was no response, no stirring. On a spur-of-the-moment whim, I packed one more thing into my backpack, just in case. A Hail Mary. Making my way to the scene of the accident, it was impossible to tell anything had ever happened there. I could barely even make out the place where I swerved, or where my wheel got caught in the ditch. I found the general area in the field where my car had spun out of control, and from there it was easy to find the tree I'd smashed into. It was still there. I spent hours going over it all, following the path the car had taken, starting from that tree, and working my way back. There was nothing there, nothing new. It was all just gravel, weeds, and pavement. What had I expected? A signed confession? As the sun dipped behind the clouds, I could feel a cold wind coming on. I'd lost track of time. As I turned back, there was a sudden cramp in my arm. A shock of pain crept up my spine, spreading throughout my body like a spider's web. I could feel my left arm throbbing against the bandage wrap. Something was wrong. I was in the middle of the field. I could see for miles in every direction. Cars passing by in the distance. wet grass staining my pants all the way up to my knees. In this one cold wind, cutting straight through my clothes. I shivered, but my left arm didn't. Taking a step back towards where I came from, another shot of pain struck me. This one tripped me, sending me face first into the grass. It knocked the air out of my lungs. I rolled over on my back, gasping for breath. My left hand was creeping up my stomach like a spider with a meaty tail. It stopped over my face, tapping the bridge of my nose with the index finger. I couldn't feel a thing. Moving to push it off, it instead struck back, grasping my right hand in return. "Stop!" I wheezed as I sat back up. "Just stop. Stop this." But it didn't. Ned, I just sat there, a wounded man holding his arms. I struggled back and forth for well over half an hour, getting back on my feet only to get knocked back down. By the time I'd made my way back to the road, I looked like I'd been hiking for miles. My hair was a mess and my clothes were covered in grass and mud. I had a handprint across my face like I'd smacked myself. I'd trusted myself with a short drive to get there, but I wasn't sure about going back. It felt reckless to get behind a wheel in my state. Still, I couldn't just walk all the way back home, and having it towed would be a pain in the ass. I got back in my car while I thought about it, wiping myself off with a towel from my backpack. It'd gotten dark outside. The overcast didn't help. I could almost taste the rain. I contemplated my options and figured that if I kept it slow and only used my right arm, I could carefully make my way home. I put the keys in and turned on the headlights. There was an elk standing in front of my car. It sniffed the hood of my car curiously, then proceeded to stare me down. I was just surprised. I got a good look at it. There was something wrong with one of its hind legs. It lacked fur, and there was a sort of spreading baldness reaching halfway up the side of the body. My arm was slowly rising on its own, as if looking over the dashboard. The elk recoiled as if in pain and set off in a troubled three-legged gallop. It disappeared into the woods. Looking down at my arm, a stray thought hit me. Was this spreading too? I painstakingly made my way back home. I dropped my backpack in the hallway, locked my front door, and collapsed into the shower. I was exhausted. I stood in the shower for about half an hour, looking down at my mother's ring. I was wearing it on my right hand now, but it just didn't feel the same. That wasn't where it was meant to be. Still, it was nice to have it back. Whenever I turned the ring a little, I could feel the engraving against my skin. It was a little gesture I did when I was anxious, as a reminder that it was still there. I got dressed and ready for a slow evening at home without any further drama. My arm wasn't acting up, but as I passed through the hallway, something didn't feel right. At first, I couldn't say what it was. Maybe the hum of an old lamp or some air duct acting up. I wasn't sure, but it was something. It had to be. I stepped up to the front door. There used to be a light coming from the hallway outside. That light was always on, and there should be a little light coming in through the peephole. But there wasn't. Had a fuse blown? I had a closer look. There was someone just outside my door. A click. My left hand had unlocked the door. The door flung open, knocking me back. A tall silhouette, close to 7 feet tall, pushed its way into my apartment. It was dressed in a sort of black poncho, covering its face with layers of bandages. A single frog-like eye stared me down as it pushed forward. I scrambled backwards on the floor. It was fast. Damn fast. It stepped forward and reached for one of my legs, but I managed to pull away in time. I got back on my feet, barely managing to pull my left arm along. It was trying to grab a hold of something, as if to slow me down. In a spur-of-the-moment decision, I grabbed a lamp from the windowsill, throwing it across the room. The intruder ducked, then came at me again. I ducked under, just in time, and headed for the door. As I reached the front door, my left arm tried to force it shut. I fought against myself to get out, but it was useless. The door was shut and locked, and my left hand refused to budge. The 7-foot-tall shape came around the corner, slowly approaching. I had to think of something. Anything. My backpack. It was right there. I had packed a couple of things earlier. A towel, some bandages, painkillers, and a water bottle. But I'd also packed some lighter fluid. Seeing as how my left arm had reacted so violently to boiling water, I had this stupid idea that the prospect of a straight-up fire would do something even worse to it. It didn't seem so stupid anymore. I grabbed the lighter fluid and sprinkled it on my left arm. The tall shape stopped, seemingly reacting to the smell of it. I wanted to say something, but all that came out were empty breaths. We were like animals, circling each other, waiting for one to make the first move. I emptied the lighter fluid, grabbing a box of matches. I held the box with my mouth and a triplicate of matches in my hand. I spilled the rest on the floor. For a moment, we just looked at one another. A single inhuman eye peeking through the bandage wraps. The vague shape of 4, maybe 5 extremities at its side. How many arms did this thing hide under the poncho? A flash of realization came to me. This is what I had almost hit with my car. And with that, I lit the matches. It leapt at me, but it was too late. The moment the open flame touched the skin on my left arm, it detached. The open nerves just let go of me, and the thing fell off my body. It squirmed on the floor like a dying animal, grasping at whatever its fingers could reach. I live up in Monroeville, Pennsylvania. For those who don't know, it's a historical site when it comes to horror movies, being that it has the mall where they recorded the original Dawn of the Dead back in 1977. The town itself isn't that different from any other, but the type of people we occasionally get passing through can certainly be interesting. There's the occasional tourist group, horror convention, and several Romero tributes. All I'm saying is that we're pretty used to seeing weird stuff around here. Not like every day, but more often than I'd like to admit. So when I first saw a flyer for something called the Traveling Graveyard, I didn't give it a second thought. However, it happened to be taped to a wall just outside of the Indian restaurant where I waited in line for my Friday night tikka masala, so I gave it a look. It took me a few seconds to even realize what it said. It was such a strange collection of words. Like raspberry shoes, hug missile, or bright black. I had to look closer. Kinda like you did when you clicked this. I took a picture of the flyer, got my order, and made it back to my car. I could tell it was gonna rain. I spent some time checking the picture in my car, zooming in on the details I might have missed. The flyer had a simple vector graphic style picture of a tombstone with an elderly couple standing behind it. They were leaning against one another, smiling, and looking straight forward. At first it looked fine, but once I zoomed in, I noticed little discrepancies. For example, they had too many teeth. I could count several rows of them. Another was that the woman in the picture, who at first looked like she was leaning on her husband, was actually grabbing him by the neck. The Traveling Graveyard, it said, with coming this Friday to Monroeville, printed in small letters underneath. There was an address and a bunch of company logos at the bottom. Honestly, I didn't recognize any of them, but it looked legit, like some kind of sponsored event. I figured it might be a movie premiere, given the town's history. Lucky for me, the address was on my way home. I could swing by and just catch a glimpse. I hadn't heard of any big projects being filmed in the area, but sometimes those things can fly under the radar. Then again, it could be a club or some kind of opening event. There was no way to tell. I sent the picture of the flyer to my buddy Henry, who immediately called me up as I pulled out of the parking lot. The guy lives for horror stuff.
What the hell is it?
He spurted out, not even saying hello. No idea, checking it out on my way back.
I'll meet you there.
You don't have a car.
I'll bike.
He hung up before I got the chance to ask him about it. Had no idea he even knew how to ride a bike. I made my way to the address. The road was mostly gravel, leading through a small forest passage just outside of town. Still pretty central. I could see the lights in the distance. I heard something up ahead and noticed that I wasn't the first car to arrive. And there it was, just around the bend. The Traveling Graveyard. The place used to be a field for dog agility competitions, but I hadn't seen any arranged for quite some time. Now it was a graveyard. At least 4 dozen tombstones, all neatly arranged. A black cast iron fence surrounding the area, and an honest-to-God church waiting at the end of a long dirt path. No haunted house, Halloween decor. Just an actual graveyard that had sprung out of seemingly nowhere. Some cars came, others went. When the crowd settled, I counted 9 other people who were curious enough to stick around. They'd stepped out of their cars to take pictures and chat. Some thought it was a kind of promotional thing. Others were convinced it was a movie set. When Henry finally arrived, he was practically blue in the face. I stood there leaning against the hood of my car, having my tikka masala, and it took him a solid 3 minutes before he could even talk. When he finally did, he almost threw the bike in a trench. Old thing. Nothing short of a miracle that the chain hadn't rusted shut or broke on the way here.
You're driving me back.
He wheezed. I just nodded, my mouth full of chickeny goodness. I pointed down the road towards the church.
Hell of a set.
Henry grinned.
What you think? Lionsgate? Universal?
What?
The production money, man. Movie magic. This is, big time. Which one you think it is?
I couldn't answer. Henry seemed convinced already, but I wasn't so sure. If this was a movie set, why would it have that genuine graveyard smell? The soggy grass, the fresh dirt? You can't put that on screen. I finished up my Friday dinner and joined Henry inside the gates. There was a couple ahead of us who were the first to go through, and I could tell they had to make an effort to get in. The gate wasn't just a prop, it was solid iron. Henry just oohed and awed, not paying too much attention to the details. For example, there were no names on the tombstones. They looked real though. We followed the others inside, walking all the way up to the church. It was a strange building, much smaller than a modern church. I couldn't imagine it being 2 pews wide. It was tall though, and had a looming bell tower. I looked up to see if I could spot anyone up there, but it was getting too dark. The gathering rain clouds weren't helping. Henry elbowed me, pointing at the church.
A little help?
They were pulling the doors open. It took 3 of us to do it. Good thing we did, as the first drops of rain just started poking at us. We all gathered, expecting some kind of event manager to reward us for our curiosity, maybe some movie swag or something. But as those doors swung open, there was nothing. Not a soul. Just dusty old pews, badly insulated stained glass windows, and an empty altar up front. Not a single cross or Bible to be found, but plenty of dry and dead moss. The place was either ransacked or half-finished. Henry seemed to think the latter, while I was leaning more to the former. The peeling paint on the walls wasn't there just for show, it was old. Probably lead-based too.
This is some of the nun kind of shit.
Henry whispered reverently.
Holy This might be a preview screening.
Henry, I know you like the fucking view up there, but pull your head out of your ass, I snapped back. This is not a fucking movie set.
Like hell it ain't.
He chuckled.
Look, see? Plastic flowers.
He picked up a flower from under a pew, only to realize that it wasn't plastic. It was dried. A strange, dry, tinted sunflower. The rain was picking up outside. Some of the others turned around to go back, but most of us stuck around to explore the church. We were already invested, and this trip had to mean something. Pennsylvanians aren't about to waste their Friday night just because someone decided to drag them out into nowhere. If anything, they'd be leaving with the communion wine and calling it a good one. I wasn't all too convinced, though. Some of it just looked a bit too real. Checking the pews, I could see little scratched-out letters and numbers. There were a lot of years marked, but none of them seemed to date past 1890. There was also a whole slew of names hastily scrawled on the walls, possibly by children, judging by the height and legibility. At least a dozen names. Boys and girls, no surnames. I stepped back out into the rain and called my buddy Luke. Reception was a bit spotty, but the call got through.
Yeah?
He answered, trying to speak through the static. Hey, can you look something up for me?
What?
Look something up for me. It took me 3 tries to explain to him that I wanted some info on the traveling graveyard event. Maybe we'd seen the wrong date, or there was some kind of misprint. This was clearly the right place, but it didn't seem like the right time. Luke said he'd look it up and call me right back. I stayed outside for a while, huddling under the roof. I looked down the path leading up to the church to see if the others had already made it out. I figured they had, since I couldn't see them anywhere. And then again, their cars were still parked outside. And another thing, the gate was closed. We'd left it open. Why would they close it? I had this sinking feeling that I was missing something obvious, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Like that feeling when you leave home, convinced that you're forgetting something important. I looked around, letting my eyes drift over the tombstones. but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Then again, the rain was making it all harder to see. Henry joined me just as Luke called me back. I kept getting disconnected the moment I pushed to accept the call. It got dropped over and over, 3 times in quick succession. On the 4th, a weak signal came through. I could barely make out what Luke was saying. There was so much interference that most of it came out sounding like he was stuck in a microwave. A few words pushed through, mostly asking things like, "What the fuck?" and "What are you talking about?" It didn't take a genius to get that he had no idea what we were talking about, and that this event was unheard of. I tried yelling the address back at him if he wanted to check it out himself. I spelled it out over and over, but he just couldn't hear me. Finally, as the 4th call disconnected, I texted him instead. I was surprised to see that it went through. Henry just sneered at me.
I don't like that look,
He said.
What's going on?
"Where did the others go?" I asked, brushing some rain out of my hair.
What? What others?
The guys who left, there was like 4 or 5 of them.
Oh, they went out back, I think.
Henry took me back inside, pointing to one of the stained glass windows. He was right. I could see a bunch of people walking back and forth between the graves. There was only one problem. There were 7 of them, not 4 or 5. Henry counted them with me, and the other remaining people in the church stepped up alongside us. We could barely make the others out in the rain, but it was clear that there were a few too many.
Maybe more came by.
Someone whispered.
Maybe they're the event people.
Can't see more cars.
Someone responded.
Were they always there? Did we check?
And finally, as we all quieted down, I heard Henry whisper.
What the fuck are they doing?
That's what we were all thinking. They were all just standing there, seemingly immobile. They weren't running for cover or leaving altogether. They just stood there as if held by some invisible will. Puppets, waiting for their strings to be pulled. Then from the other side of the room, a whisper.
There are more on this side.
At least 8, possibly more further in. No idea where they came from or what they were doing. If anything, they looked more like statues than people. For a moment, we all just stood there, trying to imagine what the hell they were trying to do. Finally, the couple who'd stepped in ahead of us chimed in. They were leaving. I was inclined to join them, but something told me it was a bad idea. Besides, Henry wasn't ready to let me go just yet. If anything, he was getting excited. This all seemed like part of the event to him. Instead, the rest of us gathered at the open doors, watching the 2 wander into the rain. Only me, Henry, and this 16-year-old looking kid remained indoors. Once they got halfway, they turned to us and screamed. It was so damn fast. They came from both sides of the building, beelining straight for the 2. 16 bodies in total, all drenched by the rain. I could make out some vague shapes, like a girl in a white dress and a tall man with a black suit. They weren't really running. It was more of a strange walk, like their entire body was on a swivel. They rolled their spines back and forth, having their necks bobbing back and forth. One of them fell over, smacking his head on an unmarked grave. The couple made a run for the gate, but it was too high to climb. They tried helping one another, one stepping into the other's hands, but it was too late. Some kind of instinct wanted me to run out there and help them, but I didn't. I just stood there waiting to see what would happen. They grabbed the man first. He was still holding up his arms, trying to get his girlfriend over the iron fence. They lifted him off his feet in what looked like the most casual effort, and a second later they threw him, straight up. Like a balloon taking flight, he accelerated upwards, past the rain, the clouds, and into the sky. He kept tumbling back and forth, weightless and desperate. He flailed like a bird with a broken wing, but it was useless. I could hear him screaming as he went higher and higher and higher. His panicked screams faded into the rain. They only managed to grab the woman by her foot, but it was enough. It's as if she was put into a spin, her head and body drifting upwards as she grasped for the fence. It slipped by her fingers as her piercing death scream cut through my nerves like a hot knife. The higher she went, the more passive the crowd became. They slowed down and the swivel of their bodies was stiffened into a statuesque back-straightened stance. The 3 of us just stood there, not knowing what to do. I couldn't move. I wanted to slam the doors shut, but I didn't know what would set them off. I didn't dare to look at Henry or the kid. I barely managed to force air into my lungs. Henry's world had shattered. I could hear him muttering, "What the fuck," over and over and over. He had the look of someone trying to figure something out, but the answer never came. After a few minutes, we moved. We noticed no one came on us. They seemed to have gone back into some kind of inactive state, and nothing seemed to rattle them. At one point, Henry almost laughed. The adrenaline must have gotten to him.
It's fine,
He said.
we got this.
Before I got the chance to say anything, he knocked on the door. Both me and the 16-year-old looked at him like he'd signed our death sentence. My heart leapt out of my chest, but nothing happened. He knocked, and they didn't even turn around. "Get your head straight," I whispered. "You're not just messing with your fucking life." Henry just smiled through his teeth, but I could see he was just as scared as I was. Pupils wide, short, shallow breaths. Hell, the 16-year-old was probably the only one of us actually paying real attention. She was short, with black hair, some kind of pixie cut, and had a nose ring. She kept looking back and forth, both between the two of us and at the crowd gathering outside. She tapped my shoulder, forcing me to make eye contact.
Help me with this.
We started dragging one of the doors shut, but it was way too heavy. It had been one thing pulling it open with dry dirt under our feet, but now with the rain, it was getting downright difficult. It wasn't until Henry got out into the rain to push that we made some progress. But the moment he stepped into the rain, they all turned towards us. Like a motor spinning to life, their movements became animated. Every limb a fluid motion, heading our way with complete abandon. They stumbled over one another, over the graves, slipped in the mud, but kept going forward. We both grabbed Henry and pulled him in, and the moment he stepped inside, they stopped moving. All three of us tried to catch our breaths. Henry's manic smile was still plastered on his face. He'd cracked hard.
It's the rain.
Said the pixie-cut girl.
It's something with the rain.
Using my belt and plenty of patience, we pulled the other door shut. There was no lock, but as long as we kept out of the rain, it seemed simple enough. The bodies outside weren't paying us any attention. The pixie-cut girl kept rambling on about whatever wild theory came to her mind. Aliens coming to take us away. Some kind of rapture. But it all came back to that one point, that it was all connected to the rain. Henry had other ideas. He figured we ought to just stay inside and call for help, which in itself wasn't a bad idea. It's just that we couldn't get any coverage. Looking up, hoping some kind of god would give me a hint, I stumbled upon an idea. "The bell tower," I said. "We can climb up there." So we did. We made our way to the second floor. The pixie-cut girl was the lightest of us and had the most expensive phone. We figured that rickety old ladder would hold her. We double and triple checked it, and it seemed fine, but she was hesitant. Finally, she just shook her head.
You do it.
She said, pointing at me.
I'm not getting up there.
There was no time to argue. I started climbing, one creaky rung at a time. When I finally made it up, I could see all through the graveyard. The rain was pouring down, making the roof of the bell tower creak. In the distance, I could see the edge of the iron fence, but everything outside of that was covered by the rain. There could have been a dozen police cars just outside, and I'd have no way of knowing. That's when my phone started buzzing. Missed calls and messages, all from Luke.
Where are you? Hello? Is this a prank? Pick up.
And finally, a picture, a selfie of Luke, standing in an open, empty, damp field. I didn't even realize how long I stared at it until I heard a breaking shingle. Drops of water made their way down my spine as a hole opened above. My screen was unresponsive, so I wiped it with my jacket. From downstairs, I could hear Henry's jeering cackle.
Hey, looks like they're moving, buddy.
Hurry the fuck up!
Added the pixie-cut girl. There was a strange sound like very slow woodpeckers. Something hard hitting the side of the building over and over again. I dialed 911 as fast as I could, but the damn connect button refused to work. The water was interfering with it. As the call lit up with a green symbol, I saw something peeking over the edge of the roof. She was young but no child. Eyes hollowed out, leaving empty holes on the inside of her blackened skull, her mouth wide open, her lower jaw swinging back and forth. She wasn't breathing. She wasn't in pain. And as she dug her slippery fingers into shingle after shingle, making her way up the side of the building, I could tell that there was nothing left of a person in there. All that remained was some kind of instinct-ridden machine, aching to send me on my way. An operator answered, asking me what my emergency was. "I need help," I wheezed. They're going to..." Looking at her, there was no doubt of her intentions. "They're going to fucking kill me." I was so blindly terrified that I didn't even look behind me. Cold fingers brushed against my jacket. Long, broken fingers reaching my way. A tall man with a suit, his head hanging low. I could see the rainwater pool in the back of his eye sockets, making it look like he never stopped crying as it squelched out with his every move. I recoiled, only to completely lose my balance. I sunk down halfway down the ladder and fell. I landed really bad, putting all the weight on my ankle. I could feel something snap, followed by a tremendous pulsing pain shooting all the way from my heel up my spine. My phone slipped out of my hands and slid across the floor. Henry just managed to catch it moments before it tumbled down to the first floor. He picked it up, yelling at the operator, "Hello, hey, is anyone, hello?" There was no response. We could barely get reception down there. In between my thumping heartbeats, I could hear the pounding fist go quiet above. A steady stream of water from above stained the carpet. Giving in to his intrusive thoughts, Henry chucked my phone all the way across the room, breaking one of the stained glass windows. In the aftermath, I did my best to support my, probably, broken ankle. We used our socks as a makeshift bandage, trying to it in place. It didn't help much, but it made it easier to jump on one foot. Still, every movement teased me with a tickle of pain, threatening to send shockwaves throughout my body, tearing all the way up my spine. Finally, the three of us just sat there. I don't know for how long, maybe an hour, maybe two. The rain wasn't letting up. "What the fuck do we do?" I sighed. We can't do shit,"
We fucking fight them.
nodded Henry.
They're not that fast.
"Try that again, but without a fucking car for a brain?"
What? We can take them. I told you, we got this.
The pixie-cut girl just shook her head and stayed quiet. She was working on something. We were growing tired and sluggish. If we were to do something, now would be the time. Henry had found some kind of iron rod broken off from the second floor railing. There was some weight to it, but he'd be insane to actually try to fight them with it. The pixie-cut girl had been staring straight ahead all night, tapping her foot. Then finally she spoke out.
I can make that fence.
She said,
You got a car?
"Yeah," I nodded. "But you'll come back for us, right?"
I'll ram the gate. It's closed but didn't seem locked.
Henry shrugged his way into the conversation.
No way you'll make it.
He said,
They're too close.
I looked back at the broken window, then back at the pixie-cut girl. "We can draw them over." We put our plan to work. Henry and I knocked out on some more glass from the window, allowing rain to trail in. We could immediately hear movement on the roof as we let the rain soak our skin. We held on, waiting for a clear sign. They started falling off the roof in droves. Thunk after thunk of meat just slapping into the dirt. Not a single gasp, twitch, or grunt. We counted the bodies. 11, 12, 13. I prepared to give her the signal. 14, 15. She had pushed the door ajar and was ready to go. 16. She burst into a sprint as we moved away from the window. Henry hurried to the front door, and I followed to the best of my ability. She was gunning for it, but there was a problem. There were far more than 16 out there. There was at least double. She kept going, weaving past them. As she finally reached the far side of the fence, she leapt up, putting her foot in the middle of the bar and kicking herself upward. In one swing, she flung her lower body over the fence.
Holy shit.
Murmured Henry.
You think she's...
She's okay, I nodded as if to convince myself. She'll make it. There was a beep in the distance, followed by an engine roaring to life. Moments later, the gate flung wide open. She drove straight ahead, aiming for the church. At least 8 of them toppled over, being flung left and right, smacking against the hood of the car. She'd almost made it halfway there when I heard this strange metallic groan. The car was slowing down and lifting. It was about 2 full feet off the ground when it started to wobble. The combined touch of all those things seemed to be able to send anything off, even a car. I saw the pixie cut girl trying to get her belt off, but the added movement just made the car topple over to the side. As it tipped over to the driver's side, I saw her struggle to climb out the passenger seat. The car started to lift again, this time reaching over 6 feet. Finally, the crowd let go of it as it started slowly drifting upwards, with the pixie cut girl still in it. She was a full 10 feet off the ground when she finally got out. The rotational force flung her out, making her hang from the passenger's side door in midair. Then she slipped. We watched her slip into the crowd, screaming. And then, just like those before her, she started to drift into the rain clouds. Dozens of hands sent her on her way, holding their arms high, like a silent wave goodbye. Henry nodded at me.
All right then,
He said.
I'm going for it.
I didn't react in time. He bolted out the door, swinging wildly with his iron rod. He connected with one of them, tearing off an ear and a solid chunk of jaw. Still, that did little to stop them. Luckily for Henry, he was fast, almost fast enough to make it. We just hadn't counted on the car coming back down. Whatever up there took it didn't want it. The car came crashing down with a deafening crunch, taking both Henry and 2 of those things with it as it belly flopped into the mud. And then there was just me, my screams, and the rain. For hours, I just wandered back and forth on my own. I kept trying to make up a plan in my head, but all I ended up with was this sense of my stomach lifting into the air. That sucking kind of feeling you get when you fall. I had nothing to eat. I sure as hell wasn't going to drink the rain. In the end, I was left with only one choice. I had to try. I stepped up to the open doors, steeling myself for what's to come. I saw the crowd outside waiting in the rain. They knew there was one left. I did that at least 4 times, stepping up, backing down. I couldn't force myself to die like that. I just couldn't. Finally, I just collapsed into the front pew, screaming in frustration. Not like that had moved those things anyway. I noticed something under one of the pews. The couple who'd been first inside had forgotten a small bag. Apparently, they'd anticipated bad weather, as there was a folded-up umbrella inside. It wasn't a good plan, I'll admit to that. I couldn't tell how those things worked, but this was the best thing I could come up with, and the greatest chance I had. I unfolded it carefully and tried to step outside, just a little. As the first raindrops hit the plastic, I expected explosive movement. Instead, I got nothing. Inch by inch, I made my way outside. I tried my best to put a smooth weight on my foot, but I just ended up jumping. Taking those little jumps in the mud was close to suicide. One slip up, and that'd be that. I could barely hear my panting breaths over the pouring rain. At one point, I held the umbrella at a bad angle. Some water touched the back of my leg, causing all now 40-something creatures to turn my way in an instant. I stopped, and they did too. Empty skulls all around, hungrily waiting for me to slip up. Little by little, I made my way past them. Some were only a few feet away. I walked past the gate, and I kept walking. I didn't even notice when the rain stopped or the sun came back out. I didn't notice I was back in that dog agility field. I barely even reacted to Luke waving me over from the parking lot. Turns out everything was gone. Not just the people, but our cars and the graveyard itself. Only thing I could find that showed Henry had ever been there was his rusted out bike by the side of the road. Maybe the church was never there to begin with, at least not in this world. And yet it was the realest thing that ever happened to me. They never found the others, or my car, or anything else. Hell, it seemed like pretty much no one had even seen the flyers around town. I tried looking up people who came there and left, but they seemed to have no recollection of ever seeing the church. I've talked to some of them here on Reddit. I checked the company logos on the flyer again, just to try and find some kind of clue. Turns out it was all fake. There were some people who claimed to have seen someone put the flyers up, but all I got was that she looked young. I've never seen or experienced anything like that night. Nothing. But this is why I always keep an umbrella around.
Dad, I'm gonna be a ghost.
Mary has always been fascinated by the supernatural. It's been one of those ever-present interests that have persisted over the years, sometimes to a troublesome level. But this was different. She'd sat me down at the kitchen table and told me this like it was some sort of revelation. This was her telling me something serious and fundamental about herself. This was a change, a shift, something important that she wanted to involve me in, and I had no idea what she meant.
I'm stating my intention.
She said,
That's the first step.
"Honey, what are you talking about? What steps? What are you?"
I'm not here to argue, Dad. I'm just telling you what's gonna happen.
"I'm just trying to understand what you're saying. You're scaring me, Mary."
I'm taking active steps to ensure my place in the afterlife. It is no different than when Mom took me to church. I'm following my beliefs. I'm going to be a ghost, a spirit, and the first step is to state my intention.
"I don't know what to say," I sighed. "I just want you to be happy. Please, I'm trying to understand."
You don't need to do anything. This isn't about you.
"I know, honey,
I've said what I need to say, Dad. I just need your support.
So here's a little history lesson about Mary, or Miriam. She turned 19 last September and has been saving up to study at WVU next year. I'm helping her to the best of my ability, and she has the inheritance from her mom to go through, but it's still a bit of a struggle to make ends meet. Ever since she was a kid, Mary has been a bit of an oddball. Her mom had some personal problems and left us at an early age, only to pass shortly afterwards. There was an element of substance abuse, but Mary was never around for that. I've had full custody of her all her life. That Mary even remembered her mom taking her to church was an honest surprise. I don't have a lot of fond memories of Mary's mother. The good times we had is so far in the rearview mirror that I can barely see them. And when I do, they look pretty bleak. Mary's interest in the supernatural blossomed somewhere around her 6th birthday. When other girls wanted to be Disney princesses, Mary wanted to be a ghost. And not just the kind where you wear a white sheet with some holes for eyes, but pretty advanced stuff. Pale white foundation with dark eyes. She even asked me to get her those all-covering sclera contact lenses, but I put my foot down. She was still too young in my opinion. Even so, I probably bought her half a dozen Victorian-looking dresses so she could turn herself into a ghost for Halloween. It was her thing. Everything was ghost this and ghost that. I just figured she'd grow out of it, that she would be done with it and move on to something new. But that didn't really happen. It just matured in a way. Little cartoon ghosts turned into spooky Goosebumps type stories. Then TV shows and scary movies. Then reality shows with ghost hunters. Then horror movies and listening to mediums online. And as she reached her teenage years, her interest reached a whole new level. A step away from the fun and quirky to the dark and practical. And now that she is an adult, albeit young adult, she came to me with this absurd statement, that she, my Mary, was going to become a ghost. I subtly talked to some of her friends and checked her social media. It's hard keeping track of all the ways kids can express themselves nowadays. And yes, Mary is a grown woman. She can do what she wants. I've raised her right, but this just sounded wrong. Still, I didn't find any evidence of any kind of abuse or harm. Mary still posts wholesome memes about her favorite salty licorice candy or sharing upbeat inspirational TikTok videos. She's not that different from other girls her age, in many ways. She's a young adult with ambition and drive. So this conversation came out of nowhere. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept walking up to her door to hear if she was sleeping. It was hard to tell, and I didn't want to bother her. She deserved her privacy. Instead, he ended up pulling an all-nighter. I was on my tablet for hours, looking for signs of whatever she talked about. Actual, practical steps towards becoming a ghost. Something about stating your intention. My eyes had started to roll back into my skull when I finally found a whiff of relevant content. A series of video lectures from someone who called themselves a paranormal researcher. I looked them up. They're just some loon from some middle-of-nowhere town in Minnesota. Not exactly a leading expert in post-natural supermortem experience research, in my opinion. How is that even a field of study? Doesn't even make for a good acronym. But this video series was about the practical steps to becoming a ghost or vengeful spirit. It all sounded very official. They even had charts, and I figured this was where Miri had been inspired. First step, to state your intention, verbalizing it and putting it out there. They called it a path from realization to actualization. I figured that, hey, at least it was just the first step. And she'd come to me about it, so at least she trusted me enough to share this experience with me, whatever that entails. The second step was called anchoring, imprinting an item, piece of clothing, or symbol to your identity. Something simple to focus on at the last moment of life, which can become an anchor to your supermortem experience. The video reviewed ways of anchoring and things that make appropriate anchors. This was where the idea of haunted things come from, the anchor. The third and final step was by far the most disturbing. Emotional devastation. By combining an anchor with the intent to pass into a supermortem being, at the time of massive trauma, you could solidify a supermortem connection. The greater the scale and depth of the trauma, the more potent the reaction. They spoke about it so casually, like it was a high school science experiment. But what they were actually suggesting was nothing short of personal calamity. Murder, death, and tragedy. Was this really what Miri was aiming for? The next day when she was at work, I decided to go through her things. It wasn't my proudest moment, but I was only doing it to see if there was any more information about these steps and her ambition to follow them. What would it mean to Miri to experience emotional devastation? Was she planning something? What would that even look like? Thankfully, I didn't find anything overtly dangerous. No weapons, no goodbye notes, nothing out of the ordinary. Thank God. But there was the second step, an anchor. She had an obvious anchor, her silver cross. It was a necklace she'd worn since she was a kid, a memento from her mom. It was an obvious choice. She rarely, if ever, took it off. This put me in a dark place. If she was already at step 2, she could be on her way to step 3 at any moment. Maybe even right then and there. Look, I was in a bad mental space, and this whole situation wasn't making things better. Miri is her own person, and I support her to the core of my being, but I'm also a father, and that part of me doesn't go away. So I got in my car and I went to see her at work. I was exhausted, panicking, and confused. Didn't even notice that I parked in the handicapped space. I just stormed in. She was just working her shift. Didn't seem to have a worry in the world. Needless to say, we didn't have a very constructive conversation. She said some pretty harsh things, and not all of it was untrue. I didn't stay long. Miri and I had trouble talking after that. I tried to bring it up during dinner, but she just locked herself in her room with a takeaway salad from work. I tried messaging her, but she left me on read. I stood outside her room and asked her to talk to me. Nothing. I crashed hard that night. I was exhausted, physically and mentally. Miri still wasn't talking to me, and I had to recover from my all-nighter. I went to bed early, hoping it would all feel better in the morning. I wish that was all there was to it. A couple of bad days. But no, there was more. I woke up in the middle of the night. A single sliver of light peeked in through the bedroom door, poking me in the eye. I turned to face the door only to see Miri standing in the doorway. She just stood there, still in her work clothes. One hand on the doorknob, one hand holding something. Miri wasn't looking at me. She had this odd blank stare, like she was looking straight through me. Her mouth hung open, slack-jawed. She was panting, as if she'd been running. I looked at her. She looked back. There was this primal part of me that didn't recognize her. Something telling me that this wasn't Miri. This was something else. Something dark. After a while, she just up and left, closing the door behind her. I didn't even notice I'd been holding my breath until the door clicked. It felt like I'd stared down a lion. I hurried up to the bedroom door and reached for the handle. But I stopped myself. I'd never lock that door. Miri didn't lock hers and I didn't lock mine. It was a social contract, a show of trust. But it brought an important question to mind. How far was I willing to trust my daughter? I tried talking to her the next day, but I only had a few minutes before she went to work. I had work too, so I couldn't do much to keep her in the conversation. She just acted like she didn't know what I was talking about. There was no step 3. There was no big plan. She hadn't been at my door last night. No, no, no. If anything, I was the one being strange. That's how it sounded, at least. I had trouble staying focused at work. We'd been having some staffing issues, and some of us had to pick up the slack. Micah and his twin boys had been sick after their latest camping trip. Meanwhile, I could barely remember the last time Miri and I spent some quality time together. Between work and her diverging interests, there was little for us to talk about. And now there was even less. The following night, I considered locking my door. I had trouble sleeping. There was that gnawing thought in the back of my mind that maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't wake up. If Miri was serious about this thing, she might do something stupid. I didn't like to think about it, but it was possible. Killing your dad might be one of the most emotionally devastating things one could do. If she really believed in these steps, this study, then there was no telling what she might do. But somewhere around midnight, I drifted off to sleep, and just like the previous night, it didn't last very long. I woke up by that stray light hitting my eyes again. I peeked out from the covers only to see Miri's silhouette against the hallway light. This time, she was holding a knife. "Miri?" I yawned. "Miri, what are you—"
Shut up.
she growled. "Honey, I'm just—"
Shut the fuck up.
She'd never spoken to me like that. Her hands were trembling, knees bent like she was ready to pounce. I found myself looking for something to shield myself with, but there was nothing. Maybe I could push her down with a pillow, or wrap her in a bedsheet. She took a step forward, but stopped herself. I reacted instinctively and shot out of bed, pressing myself against the wall. Miri just smiled. Her breathing was forced and rattled.
Just shut the fuck up. Let me do this.
She continued.
I want to do this.
"Honey, you have to talk to me." For a moment, she looked up at me.
You're right.
She said,
Not tonight.
and then she left. I followed her into the hallway, calling for her to stop this, that we should talk about this, that she was sick and that I wanted to help her. I just let every word I could find fall out of my mouth like a verbal waterfall, stumbling over my own thoughts along the way. In response, she plunged the kitchen knife straight into the wall, inadvertently cutting the cable to one of the hallway lights. I just stopped and watched her go back into her bedroom, then she locked her door. I sat with my phone for hours, contemplating what to do, who to call and what to say. I wanted Miri to get help, not jail time. I didn't know what to do. I looked at all kinds of sites relating to mental breakdowns and illness, but I couldn't find anything in particular. I kept coming back to this one thought. How far would I go to protect my daughter? I decided I'd do what little I could. I would call for help in the morning. Until then, I was watching her myself. I dragged a chair through the hallway, passed the knife in the wall, and sat down next to her locked door. I'd listen and I'd make sure she was okay. Then tomorrow, she could get help. I must have fallen asleep in that chair. I woke up to the sound of a startled shriek as Miri got out of the room in the morning. She wasn't prepared to see me there. I could see she was confused and a bit hurt. This was the Mary I knew and loved. I recognized her.
I can't deal with this, Dad.
She sighed.
Not like this.
We need to talk about last night.
I'm not doing this.
She picked up her bag and headed for the front door. I followed her. Miri, you're not walking out that door. We're dealing with this.
Aren't you late for work?
Miri, for God's sake! I slammed my hand on the kitchen table, rattling an empty dinner plate from last night. Miri just looked at me and shook her head.
I'm staying with a friend tonight.
She said.
Sort yourself out.
Miri! She was out the door, but I followed her down the driveway. She got in her car, locked the door, and ignored me. I pounded on the window, called out to her, and pleaded. She just backed out and left me there. I didn't even have my shoes on. I took a sick day, trying to find someone to call for help, trying to make sense of the symptoms, but I was hitting dead ends at every turn. Some sites called her schizophrenic, others said it could be lead poisoning. One site just kept recommending overexposure therapy, whatever that is. I spent all day on the phone, but no one could tell me anything. They asked me to book a time for consultation and to take her in for examination. But as soon as I explained that she was legally an adult, the conversation stopped. It seemed that my options were to either call the police or get her to come voluntarily. Neither was a feasible option. I couldn't lose her. I tried calling Mary all day, but there was no response. She'd either blocked me or turned off her phone. She wasn't online on her socials, and she wasn't checking her email. I considered going to her job to talk to her directly, but I'd already tried that once. Going back there might get me barred forever. I tried to convince myself it was something temporary or a misunderstanding. I really tried, but the mental image of her standing there with a shaking knife in her hand had been burned into my mind. The greater the scale and depth of the trauma, the more potent the reaction. I watched the video over and over. Step 3, step 3, step 3. I fell asleep looking at my tablet that night, and for the final time, it didn't last long. I woke up again, but not to a strand of light touching my eyes. I woke up to the sound of thumping feet sprinting down the hall, heading straight for my bedroom. I wasn't prepared in the slightest. I thought Mary was staying with her friend. Instead, she burst through the door, knife in hand. She didn't even stop to breathe. She came straight at me. I rolled out of bed and tossed my covers at her. She just laughed. And not her signature Mary laugh, but something off. A cackling, hysterical laughter. It pulled at a cold nerve along my spine as my pulse raced. She was going to kill me. Step 3. As she untangled herself, I hurried into the hallway. I could hear Mary panting behind me, trying to catch up. She was so excited, manic joy. I threw myself into the bathroom, slamming the door behind me and turning the lock. I could hear her rush past the door, not even stopping to check. She had a plan. I didn't skip a beat. I scrambled for something to defend myself with. Not to hurt her, but maybe hold her down or keep her off. Tie her down or wrap her in a towel, anything. But I didn't get to think for long before I heard a thump at the bathroom window. I barely had the time to turn my head before she threw herself at it, breaking the glass with reckless abandon, throwing shards all over the floor, and falling haphazardly into the empty bathtub. I backed away, feeling a piece of glass digging into my big toe. Mary struggled to get up. She was still laughing. I backed out into the hallway, hearing the crunching noise of crackling glass as Mary got out of the bathtub. I shut the door and held it back, trying to give myself some time to talk to her. She threw herself at the door, slamming her head into it over and over. "Mary!" I called out. "Mary, what the hell are you doing?" Her laugh grew from maniacal to this deeply unsettling heaving. I could hear the thumping of her head reaching higher and higher. Seconds later, she was just making this awful droning noise, exhaling loudly against the door. The thumping stopped. "I'm calling the police, Mary. We need to deal with..." The door was torn off its hinges as Mary ripped it out of the frame. She looked about 3 feet taller, and her one arm had taken on a strange shape, like it had an extra joint. And her face, that wasn't her face anymore. I stumbled backwards. I felt a part of me grow cold as I realized I had a knife lodged deep into my left shoulder. Mary's long arm had shot out like a scorpion stinger. It was such a shock that my legs just gave out. My body wasn't responding anymore. My heart had had enough. I sank to the floor as she loomed over me. This wasn't my Mary, this was something else, and it was doing something to her just as much as it was to me. I was panicking, not knowing how to save either of us. That dark, sinking feeling where you realize just how fast you're running out of options.
I'ma be a ghost, Daddy.
The thing grinned.
I'ma be a ghost.
My mind took me down an unsuspecting road. Akin to your life flashing before your eyes, a realization dawned on me. There had been someone else in my life that had followed the 3 steps to become a spirit. Maybe inadvertently. Mary's mother had said one last thing to me the day she lost custody. She had leaned forward, spat on my shoes, and growled.
"I'll haunt your booking nightmares."
She'd said so many horrible things to me over the years, I hadn't really thought about it. It was just one more thing in a long list of abusive language. But in the context of those steps, it could be considered an intention. An anchor? Well, the Silver Cross, it meant a lot to her, just as it did to Mary. and emotional devastation. Well, pretty much everything about that woman was a tragedy, from the way she lived to the way she died. It was a long shot, but it might be her. And looking at the face of Mary's twisted image, I could recognize the malice. And as it pulled the knife from my shoulder to end me, I did what little I could. I tore the little silver cross from her neck, put it in my mouth, and bit down, breaking it into 2 distinct pieces. With a desperate shriek, she sunk the knife into me again. I recognized her anger from that day at the courthouse. This was the same woman who'd had Mary taken from her all those years ago. And with every beat of my heart, the world grew darker as I bled out on the floor. But unconsciousness is just like blinking. One moment you're there, one moment you're somewhere else. And I went from feeling bad to downright miserable. I was in a hospital recovering from 3 stab wounds, bandages on my shoulder, hand, and the side of my stomach. There was this parade of people asking to talk to me, a nurse, a doctor, and then a couple of police officers. I insisted that I had to see Mary and that I wasn't pressing charges. It was hard to explain how this could all be a misunderstanding and that I desperately wanted to see my girl again. They agreed to let me see her. Mary was wheeled in. Her feet were bandaged from severe glass cuts, so she had to use a wheelchair. There was an awkward silence as they allowed us to speak in private. When we were finally alone, she held my hand tight. I sighed with relief. "Why would you want this?" I asked. "Why would you want to be a spirit?"
It's... Dad, I'm sorry.
She took a deep breath and wiped a tear from her eye.
I just wanted to be like Mom.
Turns out Mary had been getting visits from her mom for years. A whisper in the night telling Mary to join her. Little hints and nudges. No wonder Mary had such an obsession with ghosts. She was experiencing one almost daily. She was wearing its anchor around her neck. With that gone, Mary had a clear image of what had happened. The nightly visits, the obsession. It was like a fog had cleared from her mind. Such a relief. Now Mary still has an interest in the supernatural to this day. That, if anything, will never change. But now she can explore that interest on her own terms, without any outside influence. And if she still wants to be a ghost, well, that's her choice. But I don't think a girl like Mary can go through with step 3. She really is a sweetheart. I don't want anyone to think otherwise. She's still going to WVU, and when all is said and done, I think we can get past this. But I wonder, why does she still lock her door at night? I've always had terrible stage fright. Growing up, one of my worst nightmares was to speak in front of the school. Hell, even speaking in front of my class was bad enough. Every talent show, or reading, or presentation was a sweat fest of insecurities. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. Luckily, times change. I made it through college and got a job as a technical writer, mostly repair manuals. The company I work with need to update their products and documentation every 2 years as part of their government contract, and I'm pretty much the only one who knows enough to get the job done. It's technical, dull, and amazingly well paid. I've come a far way from that nervous kid I used to be. I'm a husband and a father of 3. I drive a station wagon, I put up my own wood paneling in the kitchen, I go fly fishing in the summers, and I got a weekly date night that I wouldn't miss for the world. Some time ago, I noticed my second child, I'll call him Kevin for privacy reasons, having trouble with stage fright as well. Kevin was in middle school, and they were having a class about classic American lyricism. They could choose to either do a written exam on a novel from a selected list, or do a reading of a poem. But Kevin had just overcome a nasty bout of strep to her throat and didn't have a lot of time. He had to settle for the poem reading. He was devastated. He had trouble eating and sleeping. Being a middle child, I think he sometimes felt a bit left out. So I wanted to go out of my way to give him a bit of extra attention on this. I promised I'd get him something to read that no one else would, and that I'd help him practice. Kevin wasn't convinced, but hopeful. That was good enough for me. I asked around, and most people I talked to claimed there were rumors of a few first editions stashed away in the old library. It had been closed off for decades, and it showed, but it hadn't been cleared out. I figured if I could find something valuable or cool for him to read, Kevin would get that extra push. Maybe some obscure work by Poe or something. I had a high school friend who worked with property management for the town, Jonah. He's basically the guy who holds the keys to those abandoned places that no one really needs anymore. The town of Tomskog, MN, has a staggering amount of buildings like that. Hell, they still had keys for the church. That thing is literally on the bottom of a lake. I called Jonah up, and he was eager to help. I don't think he gets out a lot. Jonah and I went to the Tomskog Public Library one late afternoon after work. The place had been locked and barred for years. There was a defaced sign out front that once said that it had been closed for reconstruction. Most of it had either been crossed out or filled in with obscenities. We made our way inside. I had to stop to get a handkerchief to breathe through. The mildew and moisture was so thick it stung my eyes and burned my nose. I could taste it. Jonah didn't seem to mind. Apparently it was perfectly safe as long as we didn't stay too long. Since the place was so tightly boarded up, it was dark. There was a strange discoloration on the windows, and there were patches of moss growing on the floor. There were cracks along the walls where a sort of ivy had grown and died, letting flowers bloom among its roots. A couple of daffodils and a few budding sunflowers. Strange little blue things. I don't think I've ever seen them outside of Minnesota. Jonah and I made our way to the back section. We rummaged through newspaper collections and unsorted miscellanea, looking for any kind of first editions that might have been put aside. I didn't find much. Almost got bit by a centipede, though. We'd been there for about an hour, and I could already feel my lungs close when Jonah whistled me over. He'd found something. He held up a small, leather-bound book, no larger than a DVD cover. It was untitled with a beautiful blue silk bookmark.
I heard this might be here.
He smiled.
This is an original.
An original what? I asked.
A notebook of none other than E.A. Rask.
He nodded.
Poet and novelist. Turn of the century kind of stuff.
Never heard of him.
Well, it's as unique gets.
Jonah looked on through the book, mentioning a couple of passages out loud. Nothing that could really pass for poetry, or even the beginning of a short story. Most of it was just personal notes and incomprehensible nonsense. But by the middle of the notebook, we came across a couple of lesser-known works. One in particular stood out.
The Almost Man.
Jonah said.
Listen to this.
And he recited it. I wish he hadn't, but he did. The Almost Man goes like this.
Bug-eyed bows whom well nigh died, plods of drow and dew outside, gobbles the paint, the man, the way, cry-bound gags and blood-run play, throg of squab of black-eyed daw, suckled marrow and milk-soft maw.
I read it myself a couple of times. There was something about that last line that sent shivers crawling down my spine. I didn't like it. Not one bit. Let's keep looking, I sighed. This one's just wrong. We found an early collection by Langston Hughes, which we finally settled on. It had turned a couple of heads among the faculty at least, but it wasn't the kind of home run I'd been looking for. It might be enough for Kevin to get a bit of air under his wings, but I still felt like I'd failed him. I kept the notebook just in case I found something else. Jonah didn't seem to mind. On my way home, I got stuck waiting for a train to pass. I skimmed through the notes, finding myself reading The Almost Man once again. It was such a strange piece, completely out of touch with the rest of the notes. It was beautifully written in cursive. I could tell there'd been a lot of effort to put it to words. There were a couple of pages ahead that had been ripped out. Probably early drafts. Plods of drow and dew outside. It was nonsense, but I sort of felt it. I didn't like that I felt it. I didn't think too much about it at first. I forgot the notebook in the glove box and sat down with Kevin that night. We went through a couple of poems by Hughes, and I taught him a bit about the Harlem Renaissance. I think that gave him a bit of a boost to not just know a piece of work, but the history of it. Made him feel a bit more connected to it. My wife was just happy to see me so engaged. I might look disinterested when I spend so many hours in solitude on my work, but it's never been a matter of excluding my family. I've just wanted to separate them from what can be mind-dulling labor. My wife understands this, but the kids were a bit harder to convince. To them, there was no such thing as working from home. I mean, I was right there. What was stopping me from watching movies with them or playing video games? That night, I had trouble sleeping. There was something about the library air and the words of that poem that just made my stomach churn. Milk soft maw, I thought. I could taste the words. I got this sickening image of malleable bones and baby teeth, and a smell settled in the back of my mind, like the memory of something vile. I couldn't stop burping, accidentally waking my wife up a couple of times. There was also this strange noise somewhere outside, like a slow grinding against the side of the house. See, my wife and I managed to afford a pretty cheap home after she inherited a significant sum of money from her late mother. A one-story house not too far from Frog Lake, right next to a jogging trail. It's actually cheaper than a small apartment in most mid-sized modern cities. Turns out, not a lot of people move to this part of the country. Just 3 summers earlier, we'd hired a couple of painters to turn the house a sort of midwinter mint green, my wife's favorite color, with white detailing. It makes it stand out, but in a good way. 3 years might sound like a lot, but paint jobs are supposed to last for longer. As my kids went to school the next day, my youngest ran back in. He wanted to show me something. I could tell it was serious. He had that tone of voice that he just can't fake. On the outside of the house, right next to our bedroom window, was this large splotch of paint missing. It looked like it had been melted off or grinded. The edges were flaked, and the paint was still peeling. After sending my kids on their way, my first thought was just anger. I was pissed. The painters had screwed me. But as I turned to make a call, that line from the poem came back to me. Gobbles the paint, the man, the way. I turned back to the wall, looking it over. Gobbles the paint? What are the odds? I spent some time looking up the author of that piece. Apparently a big theme of his was the transfer of information, and how knowledge was a living, breathing thing, that the knowledge of something makes it come alive, effectively resurrecting the dead and forgotten into memory. E.A. Rask really believed that by putting as much of himself into his work as possible, he would live forever in a very real and literal sense. But that also went for things beside himself. Things that weren't real or never had been. That by choosing the right words and conveying the exact emotions and sounds he wished, he could make things come to be. I found this lecture by a man studying Raskian philosophy, who illustrated it beautifully. I watched it over a skipped lunch.
Think of a blue giraffe. Imagine the long neck, the slightly darker blue of its spots. Imagine the shape of the little horns and the size of the hooves. Let that image sink in. Can you see it?
He argued that just by him giving us that description, we had conjured a picture, a being into our minds. Something that had never been, now was. That was the basis of Rask, the transfer of thought and information through words. Thinking back on that notebook, I got this strange, uncomfortable thought. What the hell was he trying to put into my head with that poem? What image did he want me to see? Over the next couple of days, I felt a sense of unease, like I could feel the presence of something. Once, as I was cutting leeks in the kitchen, I felt absolutely certain that something was watching me, that if I turned around and looked out the window, something would be there looking at me. I could feel it, like an invisible hand reaching for my neck. Something that gobbles the man. There were a couple of strange noises at night. A few more splotches of paint peeled from the walls. In the early morning dew, my wife and I could see tracks leading through the backyard. Some kind of animal, or possibly a person dragging their feet. It was a Friday morning when I decided to just get rid of the damn book. I couldn't sleep, so I got up before sunrise. I forced myself to the car, opened the glove box, and read through the entire journal. I needed some peace of mind as to what it was about and what it meant. I started to get a feeling. Much of the nonsense written in that journal wasn't just make-believe. It was descriptions. They weren't established words, but I could still feel what they meant. They conveyed something to me that just settled in my mind, painting this picture, an uneasy, ugly picture. My wife called out, and I snapped out of a sort of half-conscious stupor. She was standing on the porch in her bathrobe, baggy-eyed, tussle-haired, and gorgeous. I threw the book back in the glove compartment and went inside to have breakfast. We decided to make it a bit of a special morning. We let the kids sleep in. My wife had a few hours of flex work. She could postpone a bit and drive them instead of having them take the bus. We had pancakes and hash browns, watched some morning cartoons, and finished off the last orange juice. As they all went on their merry way, all thoughts about that cursed notebook vanished. As I settled down to review some schematics, I heard something. It was that grinding noise again. I figured it was the paint peeling. I opened the window and looked out, but there was nothing there though. Curiously, the sound stopped. Sitting back down, it resumed. This time, I was quicker. I looked out. Still, nothing. But as I leaned my head back in, another line got caught in my throat. Crybound gags and blood run play. Play? Was this play? Folding up one of my backup schematics, I waited by the open window for the sound to resume. Once it did, I folded the paper into a plane and tossed it. It sailed through the air, making a sharp turn downward. I got up, looked out, and nothing. It was gone. I questioned myself. Maybe it had passed into a strange angle. The noise stopped, leaving me to wonder what it had been in the first place. What even was an almost man? I couldn't picture it. Except, in a way, I could. I just didn't want to. I really didn't want to. As I got back to work, there was a tap against the window. Just a single tap. Looking up and out, I could see a paper plane on the ground. Someone had thrown it back. I was flip-flopping between violent paranoia and trying my best to ignore it. It was crazy. There was nothing out there. And yet that paper plane was as real gets. Then again, it was only a plane. Then again, there was a noise. About an hour before lunch, I decided to go for a walk. I left a note by my keyboard in case my wife got back, wondering where I was. And still, I couldn't ease that feeling in the back of my mind. I decided to use my permit to carry and brought my handgun along. After all, there are other things out there than mine ghosts. I checked the side of the house from afar. Just as I feared, there was a big splotch of missing paint just underneath my window. It really was a botched job. Or maybe it wasn't. I took to the jogging trail, following it further north to the more sparsely populated section of town. There was a mild fog in the air, cold moisture drifting in from the lake. Little droplets formed on my arms. The steel of the gun felt like ice. I didn't even notice that I'd been holding it this whole time. I stopped myself from going too far. Following the trail all the way around could easily take over an hour. So I turned around after about 15 minutes. I hadn't seen a single living soul in all that time. I was making a fool of myself, and as I turned around, I stopped. There was a paper plane in the middle of the trail. I picked it up, looking around. I clutched my handgun, searching the tree line. Throg of squab, I muttered. A black-eyed daw. I looked to the side, thinking I saw something glistening. On closer inspection, it turned out to be a couple of darkened leaves playing tricks on my mind. Figuring I'd been close to putting a bullet into an innocent berry bush, I relaxed my shoulders. But only for a moment. It sounded like a pained moan. Somewhere halfway between a yawn and a drawn-out grunt. A rumbling gargle. I swayed around only to be knocked flat to the ground. My eyes blacked out as all air was knocked out of my lungs. I landed flat on my back, looking up at the gray, clouded sky. Something large moved past me and into the woods behind me. I could hear saplings crackle and break. I rolled onto my stomach, aiming my handgun into the forest. I could see something moving up ahead. I spotted a pair of antlers along with two frightened eyes. It looked my way, only to immediately set off in the other direction. Something had spooked it, and with that dawning realization, something in me screamed that I wasn't alone. That if I were to turn around, there'd be something there. Just like I'd felt in the kitchen, or in my study, or in the bedroom. It was there. It was real. As I spun around, handgun drawn, my world went dark with a wet whack across my temple. I must have been out for at least an hour, but to me, it was like blinking. I opened my eyes, looking into a mirror. A dusty old thing stuffed away into some old shed. I was sitting on a milk crate, barely held together by rusty nails and long-forgotten care. There were two hands on my shoulder, one with 3 massive toe-like fingers and one with 4. They had no nails. I realized something was suckling on my scalp. A massive mouth with soft, baby-like teeth, bending every which way against the skin of my head. And again, that inhuman groan. That low, droning noise. The same noise I now realized I'd been hearing, pressed against the side of my home. I looked down at my right hand. I was clearly out of it. My thoughts moved in slow motion. I was bleeding profusely. My right index finger and thumb were gone. At first, I didn't know what to think or how to process it. It had to be my imagination. It couldn't be real. But looking closer at the mirror across from me, it was as real as it gets. It was at least 8 feet tall. This massive, wet-skinned thing, like a cross between an overgrown infant and a mole rat. Its pores were large enough for me to count. I could barely see where the neck stopped and the body began. And there in the middle of what could be considered a face were 2 round, black, button-like eyes. It met my gaze through the mirror and snorted, a move that made one of its teeth come loose. It didn't seem to care, but was eager to lap up my blood. I noticed the specks of midwinter mint green paint at the edge of its mouth. I made the laziest, slowest attempt to move. It gently pulled me back, like a puppy pulling on a rope toy. My gaze flickered back and forth. "Stop," I wheezed. "You shouldn't." It groaned again, squeezing my shoulder until something popped. I cried out, and the thing snorted again. It was funny. To it, I sounded funny. Blood run play. With every attempt to squirm my way out, it pulled me in tighter. It was getting annoyed. I tried sudden jerks, slow creeps, and everything in between. But for the better part of an hour, it just held me there. At one point, it just started to bite off hair, like a cow munching on fresh grass. Huge swaths of hair torn out and swallowed. I managed to get my shoulder loose, but before I could take a step, it pulled me back. It pulled me back so hard I fell off the milk crate, rolling back into a box of tools and a half-cracked rake. Fumbling around with my healthy hand, I felt a handle. As it reached for me again, I held on tight and swung. Turns out I'd grabbed the handle of a trowel. While still rusted, I managed to swing it hard enough to open a nasty cut along the creature's triceps. It reeled back, crushing the milk crate. It lunged at me. It came down with its full body weight, but I got out of the way just in time to see it pulverize a rotten shelf. Termite dust and old wood puffed into the air as I tumbled away on the floor, finally finding the familiar handle of my handgun. I tried to grab it with my right hand, but this massive jolt of pain shot all the way from my hand to my neck. I didn't have a trigger finger anymore. I wielded it in my left hand, swung around, and aimed down the barrel. A crooked half smile with teeth no larger than a corn kernel. An amused huff. I blinked the sweat out of my eyes, and it was gone. I just looked around, firing a couple of bullets into nothing, punching holes in the decayed wood and rusted metal. My ears rung as I made my way outside. There were no signs of my fingers, just blood and bite marks. I made my way back home. My wife had come home for lunch and left just as fast. I called for help. I didn't know how to explain it all. I just told them I'd been assaulted. The rest of the day was a circus. Panicked phone calls, worried voices, pointed questions. My wife came by to sit with me, leaving the boys with her sister. There were doctors, police officers, nurses, administrators. So many faces and names. It wasn't until the soft lull of the late hours that I managed to think. My wife was sitting to my left, holding my healthy hand. Our tears had dried. There were no sounds but the humming of machines. I tried to make sense of it, a creature that came to be from hearing a poem, by thinking about it. Then again, I'd read it a couple of times to my wife, and she hadn't seen or heard anything. I figured maybe it was the notebook itself that was the deciding factor. That somehow reading from the book made it more authentic, conveying the right cadence. I turned to her as she kissed my forehead. The lights were dim. I was to be kept overnight because of the blood loss. How'd it go with Kevin's, presentation? I asked. I know he's been worried about it.
It was the damnedest thing.
She smiled.
He found just the thing to read just before class. He was excited about it, too. It had this funny sound.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah,
She smiled.
From that book you found.
My heart went cold. I'd forgotten it in the glove box. She'd driven them to school,
The one you told me about.
she continued.
He really liked it.
If there was any truth to this, any truth at all, even the most minuscule kind of it, if having it read to someone could make it somehow come to be, I hyperventilated. She clutched my shoulders, pressing the emergency button over and over, calling out for help. I felt faint as I watched the room spin. My pulse was going haywire. I just had to scream. I don't want to go into detail about what happened, not about the abductions or the maimings or the rumors. The paint peeled from walls across the neighborhood, the whispers of roaming things trampling the sunflower fields on the east end of town. I don't want to think about it. None of it. Not the ones who made it back, and not the ones who didn't. Today I wear a prosthetic. I cover my scars and bald spots with a baseball cap. I think others do too. The poem doesn't work unless you're reading it from the source. But when you do, it works. It is real, and I can't wrap my head around it. Kevin doesn't understand what happened, and I intend to keep it that way. If I can spare him the knowledge of accidentally causing this, in any way, shape, or form, I will. Jonah never experienced anything strange, and he was the one who first read it to me, so I think it's fine if you're the one doing the reading. Maybe there is something fundamentally different in the way the reader and the listener experience this transfer of thought. I don't know. I had to say something to someone. I figured this community might understand, and be careful what stories you tell. Back in my frat days, I was one of the guys helping with the hazing. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was nowhere near the kind of horror you see in the college movies. It wasn't just about humiliation. It was about getting to know people and dedicating yourself. They say that the best way to befriend someone is to ask them to do something for you. That way they are invested in you. It's harder to justify disliking someone or something if you've done them a favor. That's why we ask so much of our new pledges: time, sweat, and dedication. More often than not, we get it. It might be community outreach, small jobs, charity events, fundraising, all kinds of stuff. Like the year before me, where 4 of the pledges had a background in IT, we effectively set up a campus computer support hotline. Crazy days. In my final college year, we had a more intense hazing than usual. The guy who was in charge had seen a few too many college flicks and went a bit overboard. To make up for it, we decided we were just going to do something fun and stupid for the final night of Hell Week. Rick, the guy who handled our finances, came up with the idea of a softball game. Then some asshole added to that. What about a softball drinking game? So that's how it started. We were going to play a game where everyone had a drink in their hand. You couldn't touch the ball or bases unless your cup was empty, and we'd have a refill station right by the batter and another further out in the field. It was going to be a complete shit show, but a funny one. Something to let a little steam off. Previous years, we had a guy who could make his own alcohol. Cheap stuff, a moonshiner named Elton, lived not too far out of town, and made stuff from some kind of bark. Real prepper kind of guy. That year, Elton was having trouble with the law, not too surprising. So we had to try to find another guy. Rick had the brilliant idea to check Craigslist. We ended up with a guy out in suburbia, this strange loner kind of guy who made his own hooch in his backyard. We talked to him a couple of times and decided to go see him in person. There was no point tiptoeing around it. The guy was a weirdo, but we were asking for something weird, so it kind of worked itself out. The guy was named Ramses. That tells you half the story right there. Lived in this huge 2-story house all by his lonesome. Not even a cat. He looked like pretty much anyone. Tall, lanky guy with slick, horn-rimmed glasses. Had a quiet voice, but a sturdy handshake. Shook our hands and immediately showed us his garage. He had half his garage full of just boxes. This guy was taking and making deliveries on the daily, it seemed. He had a workbench with a bottling kit, a scale, and a label maker. I couldn't see what he was putting labels on, though. He talked to us like we were on a tour as we made our way over the mounds of empty boxes.
Been working on this stuff, on and off for years,
he said.
Got 3 fresh batches, rolling out on Monday.
Can you get it by Saturday?
Asked Rick.
It's kind of last minute, but we got a game. Saturday?
Ramses turned toward us, stroking his beardless chin. After a few seconds, he nodded.
If I heated a bit, maybe. Could work. But that's gonna cost you extra.
Not too fast.
I smiled.
We're trying it first.
Ramses looked at us. We had a solid 6 seconds of quiet before he nodded and reached for a couple glasses. The liquid had a strange smell to it. It was like a very mild fungal whiff mixed with old water and salt. Upon closer inspection, there was a clear mix of bark, possibly pine. It had a mild discoloration, red almost, and a sort of heft to it. Texture. Ramses explained as he poured.
Mostly sunflower seeds, maple, and a bit of blueberry. Oily but, rich.
I declined as the designated driver. Before Rick had a chance to down it, Ramses added a little drink mix. Coconut, I think. Rick chugged it, wincing a bit at the taste. He looked up at me with a deep cringe.
No fucking coconut!
He spat.
Holy shit, that's vile.
I like it.
Shrugged Ramses. Rick kept nodding at him over and over.
Yeah. This'll do. This'll fucking do.
We ordered 3 kegs for the softball game and went on our merry way. I didn't think twice about it. I wasn't the one holding the money. Ramses told us it'd be tricky and that he'd need as much time as possible, so he promised to drive up there with it himself. All we had to do was bring whatever drink mixes we wanted and enough ice to freeze a gaggle of penguins. We were all getting excited for it, especially the pledges. We had sort of a new guard, old guard kind of matchup, and it was going to be nice to just let off some steam. For the rest of the week, everything boiled down to shit-talking the other team in good fun, printing custom jerseys, and making chants. People were going crazy for it, and I wasn't about to stop them. Once Saturday rolled around, we made our way out to a secluded spot, an abandoned schoolyard just out of town. Most of us got there after lunch classes ended. We took our time setting up tables, snacks, and drinks. And of course, a beer pong table for those who couldn't play for one reason or another. Bluetooth speakers rocked shook me all night long, hours before the first pledges arrived. We were starting to worry that Ramses had just taken the money and ran. It wasn't much cash, but the guy had some definite scumbag vibes to him. But at about 2 in the afternoon, he rolled up with his semi and dropped it all off. He was gone long before I even got the chance to thank him. We filled up the coolers as best we could with various mixes in what we dubbed Ramses' Red Shine by now, thanks to the strange coloration. It was forbidden to start drinking until the first ball had been thrown, though, as to not pre-party ourselves into an early forfeit. One by one, the pledges dropped in. The new guard had dressed up in various shades of red, while us seniors were all blue. To round it all off, we had judges dressed in white stripes. We hadn't really planned on it being a patriotic theme, but god damn it, we were gonna lean into it. I was so hyped for it, until it was time to draw straws for designated driver. You can guess who pulled the short one. I was put in charge of music and, if need be, driving. In return, I got a free pass to drink at the next event. It just kind of sucked that I'd be the only sober person at the last outing of the hazing. I was kind of bummed about it, but it was nice seeing everyone so relaxed. Good vibes all around. The game was on. First cup of the game was chugged by Brandon. Didn't quite make it all the way, but made a decent first run. The outfielders were eager to get drunk and were already sipping their drinks in between batters. Slogans and cheers were being thrown back and forth, and I could see a few in the back row already getting into the groove. And that should have been it. That should have been the whole night. Nothing else was supposed to happen, just bros being bros. But something did happen. What happened next is why the frat isn't allowed to drink anymore. Why people get quiet when they talk about what is now an 8-year-old party legend. Why some people fell off the map and why others are only talked about in hushed tones. But it wasn't obvious from the start. I sat by the sidelines all day long. To me, it all just looked like drunk guys doing drunk things. Someone slipping, some people hugging a little too hard. It didn't seem all that irregular until one of the guys in the back row stepped out of line, drunk off his ass. I don't think he even had that much, maybe like 2 cups. This guy, Steven, was not a lightweight. Got in on a football scholarship. So Steven steps up to me and pulls out his car keys. I figured he wanted me to make sure he didn't drive. But no, instead he put the keys between his fingers, like some kind of improvised claw, and stared at me. His eyes were pulsing, like I could see the blood push through them. Breathing. He leaned in, inches from my face, eyes so big I could see myself in them.
I was an eagle.
He whispered.
In the other world, I was a fucking eagle.
He let out this shrill, animalistic screech and just started slashing at me. He was nowhere near close, but I fell out of my chair trying to get away. When he realized he'd missed, he just started stabbing into the nearby table, over and over, bloodying his hands, screeching like a fucking maniac. I backed off, expecting someone to pull him away, but no one did. Instead, my attention turned to whatever was happening out on the field. Fucking pandemonium. One of the guys had fallen to his knees next to second base, screaming at the top of his lungs, "I'll never forgive them! I'll never forgive them!" As he clutched the base plate, two guys started fistfighting, one of them claiming he did a mother of three, and another crying about how he would be 6 generations of leeches. One of the judges tore off his jersey, shrieking to the sky, "I was born of machines! A world without sun!" It devolved so fast, their pulsing eyes and convulsing movement turning them from partygoers into whatever, all in a few minutes. Screaming out nonsense, contorting their bodies like they were remembering something they weren't. As I turned to run, I spotted something in the cooler. Little white insects making their way along the edge of the ice cubes, slowly spinning counterclockwise in unison. To this day, what strikes me the most is just how damn fast it all happened. Everyone had been drinking on and off for quite some time at different paces and speeds, but it all hit them at the same time anyway, like a resonance. I thought that maybe someone had spiked it, some kind of drug. I'd seen people tweak out before, but this was just off the scale. I backed away, reaching for my phone. They were all too deep into their own worlds to notice me, even Steven and his impromptu eagle claws. I took a few steps down the path towards the parked cars, only to realize that they were all lowering their voices. Turning around, I recoiled from Rick, standing just a few feet ahead. He pointed at me with an arm he could barely keep up, his mouth agape like a fish out of water, his eyes blinking at different speeds, looking in different directions. Even from there, I could see his tongue was dry, a redness around his eyes, telling me he wasn't blinking. He just made this noise like a human siren, a long, monotone scream, like one long E, then nothing. I just stood there looking at him. I could feel their reaction before I heard it, how every pair of eyes turned to me and how they joined Rick in his outcry. This long, reverberating note digging into my skull, it made my stomach churn like something was bubbling inside me. I tried to keep walking, but my balance was so offbeat that I kept tripping on my own feet. It felt like my head was on a swivel. By some miracle, I made it back to my car. I fumbled the keys, scratching a deep cut into the paint, but I got the door open. The moment it clicked open, I saw a movement. They were coming. I slammed the door shut, feeling my insides relax as the sound was blocked out. I could see the windshield vibrate. I pulled out my phone just as 2 pledges flung themselves into my car. One of them completely smashed the windshield, while the other just flopped to the side, pulling down a side mirror. I felt my heart jump out of my chest as my fingers went cold. I put the car in reverse and prayed. It went faster than I expected. I could barely control my feet, so I just floored the gas, sending me practically flying down the dirt road. Just seconds later, I was flung forward, smacking my head into an airbag. I'd hit a tree. It is all sort of a blur after that. I stumbled out just as I saw these vague shapes coming down the road. I rolled onto the ground, landing flat on my back, knocking the air out of me. Looking up at the sky, I could hear them coming. Uneven steps and mishaps all along the way. They didn't care. It was complete, reckless abandon. At a glance, it might have been funny, stumbling over one another, over their own legs, bumping into each other, all making that awful noise, their faces slack, stupid, and ugly. Eyes reverberating with the pulse of that awful tone. With the car still running, I crawled underneath it. I saw their legs come into vision as they gathered in a circle. their screams slowly lowering back into their conversational madness. No one bent down to check under the car. I just saw dozens of legs anxiously stomping back and forth. Then one of them smacked his fist against the hood. That set the others off.
A spike!
One cried as he smacked his head into the driver's side window.
A spike in my fucking head!
Ever, forever, ever dark, bawled another as he started to tear out the passenger side seat. As a pack, they took out their inane frustrations on the car, tearing out electronics, breaking plastic panels, ripping into every soft surface with their bare hands and teeth. I saw one of them come away with the steering wheel, then he bit down so hard that 3 teeth dropped out of his head. They completely smashed it. They tore into the motor while it was still running, making the machine cry out in a metallic pain before it died. I reached into my pocket to send a text for help, only to realize I'd lost my phone when I dropped to the ground. It was a few feet to my right, among the sea of legs. There was nothing I could do but to hold my ears shut, close my eyes, and stay as still as possible. Breathing in the dirt, still smelling that strange drink on their collective breaths, growing stronger. I don't know how long I stayed there. At some point, I saw one of them stumble backwards, clawing at his own open eyes, crying like a child. Had it not been for his swollen, bleeding eyelids, he'd have looked right at me. The sky darkened as their voices grew hoarse and weak. Hours later, they were still tearing into the car, littering the ground with everything from electronics and debris to their own blood, sweat, and hair. And still they mumbled, they wheezed, they cried. Then at some point, it just sort of stopped. It was like they'd fallen asleep, right then and there, standing in this mob circle around the car. The sun had sunk well below the horizon, casting long shadows. I waited a couple of minutes, held my breath, and went for it. My arm was stiff and my fingers weak. I'd felt an oncoming cramp on and off 4 hours, and suddenly moving didn't help. My pulse spiked as I reached for the phone, feeling the cool evening breeze on my naked hand. I grabbed the phone, retracted my hand, and almost gave myself away. They'd been stepping on my phone over and over all day long. The touchscreen was dead. My instinct was to scream, but instead I bit down on my lip hard enough to break the skin. Every nerve in my body tightened. What else could I do? Could I just walk off? Were they really sleeping? I couldn't risk it. I'd be in the middle of them, waiting to be torn apart. If they could do this kind of damage to a damn car, a person would be short work. I just lay there, counting seconds, making impossible plans in my head, feeling the car growing smaller. Every tiny movement I made felt like a surrender. I pondered just poking one of them, to get it over with, these intrusive thoughts taking over my rational ones. And yet, I did nothing. I remember blinking in and out of a painful half-sleep. I remember how they just stood there, legs like a forest of jeans, shorts, and tracksuit pants. With every breath they took, I could imagine hearing a voice speaking through them. An inhale, oh, an exhale. E-O, E-O, E-O. Like a fucking lullaby from hell. As the temperatures dropped, I felt the shivers coming on. But as it seemed, so did my assailants. They were shivering something fierce. So bad, in fact, that some had to lean against the car or sit down. One by one, they dropped, bloody, battered, and raw. Some just sat down, others collapsed. Another intrusive thought wormed into my head. This one stronger than the others. Potent, desperate. Run! So I did, and I crawled out, my nerves aching from the sudden movement. I felt stray hands reaching for me, grasping at my pants, my jacket. Something grabbed a handful of hairs from my neck. But somehow, amongst this emerging sea of hands, I got through. Like passing your hand through a flame, it only hurts when you stop. I got out. Somehow I got out. I saw them all turn towards me, one by one, their eyes unfocused and worn. Some had passed out, others were about to. I realized, maybe too late, that these people were already defeated. They were sick. I reached for the closest one, an unconscious Rick, and dug out the phone from his pocket. As expected, he didn't have a screen lock. I kept looking back down at him as I dialed for help. The moment the call went through, his eyes rolled back in his skull, but I swear his mouth moved. A silent thank you. That whole night turned into a scary story around campus. Some don't even think it happened, but the Redshin night was definitely a thing. There are many reasons for people not to believe us, though. For example, toxicology came back negative. Just alcohol, and not even that much of it. Ramses was quick to leave town as he realized his fuck-up, leaving behind most of his distillery and empty boxes. Still, there was little to explain our physical reaction. It was just blueberries, maple, and the blue seeds of sunflower. I think somehow it was a mistake. He rushed the batch and something went wrong. That drink mix he poured with the first drink he shared with Rick? I think it was a neutralizing agent, just in case it wasn't ready. 4 of the guys went blind. One of them got permanent nerve damage in his neck. One of them broke his finger so bad they had to amputate. And that's just the physical pain. I can't even begin to imagine how many hours of therapy this caused. People were scarred and ruined for the rest of their lives, beating themselves into bloody submission. It got too painful being reminded of that night, so most of us have lost contact. Sometimes I read these articles, party gone wrong, young adults making idiots of themselves. Partygoers erupt into violence. And yeah, most of the time it's just a bad time. But I wonder, is it always like that? Or did someone just drink something they shouldn't? Hell if I know.